The dawn came earlier than hope in Mirefield. I still remember the hush before the village stirred, that brittle moment between night and day when the world holds its breath. I wish I could tell you I woke to comfort, to gentleness, but I woke to tension instead, the cold that wrapped around my bones, the low moan of the wind through thatch, and the relentless throb in my shoulders and back. I touched my belly as it rose within me, a silent reminder that I was never truly alone, and that the life inside me was as demanding as the world outside. You see, being pregnant here wasn't a blessing. It was a burden carried on sore feet. No one cheered when news arrived in Mirefield. No songs welcomed the coming child. Instead, whispers followed me down the lane. The stone walls of cottages and thatches overheard every step I took. By the time I reached the well, 3 women had offered advice on what to avoid eating, what to avoid touching, what to avoid thinking. I nodded along, because what else could I do between aching muscles and the sharp snap of gossip? There were no celebrations here, just another body needing to work harder at a time when it should be resting. Instead of a comfortable corner, I had this cold stone floor. Instead of gentle words, I had advice like, don't eat onions, they'll make your baby cry, and if you carry high, it's a boy. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The worst was the silenced weight of expectation. The knowledge that everyone thought my fate already sealed, that I would toil until the day came, and then I would labor and bleed and pray. I wondered what kind of mother I'd be, carrying a child in a place that never slowed down for pregnant women. I wondered what the child would feel inside, warmth and movement, yes, but also the constant tremor of fear beneath it all. I wondered if my baby would even remember what it was like to be wanted, or if they would only know the narrow space within me, crowded with aching joints and everyday grind. I stepped outside to feed the chickens before sunrise, the damp cold clinging to me. There was one that had nested in the cottage the night before, reminder that I had no private corner and no time for softness. I shooed it out, its feathers brushing my skirt, the sound echoing in that tiny room. I had to bend over too, chase it, and halfway there, cramps seized my side so sharply, I nearly collapsed. I pressed myself against the cold wall, breath stuttering in my chest. My mind flared with questions I couldn't afford to ask. Was this normal? Was I drawing closer to something I didn't understand? All I had was a name, Sister Agnes, the midwife who came sometimes, with her bag of bitter herbs and serious eyes and her promise that everything would be okay. She said that yesterday, as I sat on a low bucket, ankles thick and painful, sipping weak tea that looked more like runoff water than medicine. And yet, her brief nod was the only reassurance I received all day. The sky lightened, and all around me, Mirefield began to breathe. Doors creaked open. Children stumbled into the lane barefoot, calling for halves of stale bread handed out by neighbors who didn't trust them enough to lock their Men passed me with buckets of ashes, ready to spread new lime on the fields. Everybody moved with purpose. Not one of them slowed down because I was carrying a life inside me. Still, I did not stop. I had chores to do, a child to protect, a husband to provide for, or rather, to avoid letting down again, as I had already lost one pregnancy months ago. I still smelled the dryness of it, the stillness where a heartbeat should have been, and I carried the memory like a wound that refused to heal. My husband didn't ask for explanation, but I could tell he knew it was there when he looked at me. This time, I told myself, this time would be different. I carried water from the well that morning. The bucket was heavy, my arms shook. I thought I might drop it at any moment, and the jug would shatter. I thought I might fall and break, more than just pottery. I made it back to the cottage though, with wet jeans and blood pounding behind my eyes. The baby swirled against me, a pulse of life demanding attention. I set the bucket down and paused to cradle myself. At that moment, more sharply than any pain, I realized something. I was a vessel. It felt both awful and powerful to know that. I went on to gather eggs, 3 of them, damp with grit, and forced myself to swallow porridge made from oats and boiled turnip. My stomach screeched in protest, but I ate, because my body was no longer just mine. My every choice mattered. By mid-morning, when I bent to trim herbs, lavender, rosemary, dried and brittle, I felt the baby kick fiercely, so hard that I spilled a cup of goat's milk onto my skirt. It stained red against the pale linen. I looked down at my belly and felt something like pride, but the ache in my sides made it hard to smile. A neighbor, standing nearby, saw me clutching my stomach. She exclaimed, "Signs of strength, that is." She touched the swell as if claiming credit. "Probably a strong boy." I forced a smile. "Thanks," I said, but inside I was mumbling, "Please be okay. Please be anything so long as it's safe." I moved on to mending sewing patches onto my husband's sleeve and turning circles in needles with fingers swollen and unsteady. The cloth snagged. My finger pricked. I cursed under my breath as the patch came loose again and again. I pressed a scrap of linen against the cut, the bleeding too small to matter to anyone, but still proof that I could bleed at any moment and keep working. Afternoon moved in like a hush. The village quieted, and the light dimmed beneath gray clouds. Even the animals seemed softer. I carried more wood into the house, setting it by the hearth that stood cold and empty. Everything weighed too much. Everything hurt more than pain should hurt. And yet, I kept going, because if I stopped, even for a moment, everything could unravel. Evening came. My husband returned with a rabbit he'd snared. He skinned it wordlessly while I boiled water. He worked beside me in silence that felt thicker than words. I tore the rabbit flesh off the bone, chewed the wild herbs tossed in, bitter, sharp, and felt gratitude flare in my chest. We ate. We sat close in the flickering shadow. We couldn't really talk because there was no space, no room to breathe between survival and fear. But we didn't have to. I cradled my belly against the warmth of my armpit. The baby kicked slowly, as if drifting in water. I whispered promises into that quiet hush. I will keep you safe. I will not let you drown. After supper, I crawled into bed that felt like a sack of broken sticks. My back found every lump. My feet found every splinter in the floorboards. But I felt something solid beneath the ache, a seed of possibility. Maybe things could be different. Maybe we wouldn't just survive. Maybe we could feel something lighter than dread. I drifted towards sleep, lullabies half remembered from my own mother's soft voice. A lullaby about wildflowers and tall moonlit nights. My mother, who died years ago, one of those whose own pregnancy ended in a hush, and I still carried the echo of her voice through my dreams. If fear was the shadow, then love was the flame, dim, flickering, stubborn, and I needed it to burn brighter than the dark. So I slept poorly, but I slept. The wind rattled the shutters. The cat meowed at nothing. A dog yelped in the distance. But I felt something new, a fragile thread of resolve, weaving itself through my bones. Because living here, being pregnant in Mirefield, had sucked every sweet thing out of my days. But I was determined. It wouldn't suck every sweet thing out of my life. If this story stirred something in you, and you want to hear what happens next, how Elena finds courage in fear, how the community's secrets swell and shift, how the birth of Ash changes everything, please click subscribe. It helps me know you're with us, and makes our next tales stronger, kinder, and richer. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What did you feel most when Elena collapsed against the wall? Exhaustion from her body's labor, fear that its pain might signal something worse, or something else entirely. Did she collapse because A. Exhaustion from relentless work, B. Fear of a complication beginning? Drop your answer A or B in the comments below. I'll read every answer, and we'll dive deeper into what this means as we go forward. The road through Mirefield was never truly empty, even when it looked still. People didn't just walk it, they watched it. And that afternoon, as I stepped out into the misted gray light, the village was already watching me. Their stares weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were assessing, measuring. Everyone had something to say, if not to me, then to each other. I became a tale passed from hand to hand, like a worn piece of fabric, stitched together from old beliefs, mismatched facts, and 100 opinions too loudly spoken by women who had given birth in their own time and now believed that made them authorities on mine. The look said it all. Too big for her frame, too pale today, carrying low. Must be a girl. No, she walks too slow. It's twins. She's cursed, maybe. Remember her last? I heard she tied rosemary under the bed, and that's bad luck in winter. Every word passed over me like a shadow. None stayed long, but the cold of them lingered. I kept walking. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and the mud sucked at my boots. A wind snapped through the village like a question no one wanted to answer. I turned the corner near the blacksmith's cottage and nearly collided with Rosa, the baker's young daughter. She froze. Her eyes dropped immediately to my stomach, then to the basket she carried. When she looked up again, her face was flushed, and she said nothing, just ran. I knew why. My body wasn't mine anymore. It was a message board for everyone else's fears, hopes, and expectations. The church bells tolled, a hollow clang of time passing, as if to remind me that soon this burden I carried would become a reckoning later. I found myself at the smokehouse, drawn by habit more than hunger. The place smelled of fire and salt, and the women moved around the hanging meat with practiced grace. I joined them quietly. No one welcomed me, not in words, but they made space, and that was enough. In Mirefield, the smokehouse wasn't just for food eat, was for stories, for the things you could say when the men were elsewhere. The women worked with steady hands, their mouths half hidden behind shawls, their voices low. She bled for 2 days. Someone whispered about a woman I didn't know, and still, the baby never cried. My third came feet first. Nearly died. I was in labor so long, I forgot my name. I said nothing, but I listened. Each story entered me like steam burning first, then settling deep in my bones. Then came Sister Agnes. She moved through the smoke like she belonged to it, dressed in her usual rough-spun robes, with that strange confidence of someone who had seen death and had learned to live beside it. The women stepped aside as she passed. "Elena," she said. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "Come, let's speak." I followed her outside, where the wind bit sharper. "She's turning head down," Agnes said, placing a hand on my belly without asking. "Good, you've been drinking the tea. Yes, keep it up. And no more lifting water barrels." "I have too." Willemsbeen. I stopped. There was no excuse that didn't sound like surrender. She handed me a cloth pouch. "Use this when you bathe. Hang it over the fire first. Let the herbs open." I nodded, unsure what else to say. "She's watching you. This village," Agnes added, softer now. "Don't let their watching become your worry. That baby listens to your fear." Her words settled into me like seed into soil. That evening, I passed the well again. An old woman I barely knew stepped in close and murmured, "Don't name it yet. Names call the spirits." Then she walked away before I could even nod. By the time I reached home, the sky was almost black, the wind hissing at the eaves like an unwelcome guest. I moved slowly through my small house. Every step pressed the aches deeper into my legs. My ribs felt bruised from the inside out. I lit a single candle and unwrapped the pouch Sister Agnes had given me. Inside were dried leaves, lavender, sage, something bitter I couldn't name. I heated water and hung the bundle above it, watching as steam rose. I sat beside it, breathing in slowly. I let the herbs pull something from me, worry, pain, memory. I closed my eyes and pictured Ash, the name I whispered only to myself, tucked somewhere deep inside the warmth of me. Safe, still, waiting, not yet named, not yet seen, but mine. I remembered something my mother once told me years ago. When I was just a girl, a woman carrying life becomes part myth. Everyone thinks they know her story, but only she hears the ending before it's told. I understood that now. The village could whisper. They could guess, prod, advise, warn, but I would carry this child the way I carried every wound that didn't show. In silence, in strength, in defiance. That night, I didn't sleep, but for the first time, I didn't cry either. I was too busy listening to the wind outside, to the fire beside me, to the rhythm of a heartbeat inside that was not my own. And in that quiet, I whispered a truth that no one else needed to hear. This is not your story, it's mine. Smoke curled through the air like memory thick, lingering, impossible to escape. The scent of brined fish and slow-burning wood clung to everything. Hair, skin, fabric, even thought. When I entered the smokehouse that morning, it felt like walking into a fog made of stories too old to name and too heavy to forget. Inside, the women were already gathered. Their movements were mechanical, steady, trained by repetition and necessity. Hooks clanged, ropes creaked, flames snapped. Fish hung like pendulums in time, and around them, life moved on as it always had. Quietly, relentlessly, I joined them without a word. No one had to ask why I came. In Mirefield, a pregnant woman didn't need a reason to seek the company of other women, just the courage to keep standing when her legs ached and her mind was full. The smokehouse, for all its hardness, had become a place of unspoken permission to share, to rest, to remember, and, sometimes, to forget. There were no greetings, not in the way outsiders would expect, but eyes lifted to meet mine, nods were given, and a small space opened at the bench. That was enough. Gilda sat beside me, sleeves rolled, fingers salt-stung and red. She handed me a knife and a trout. I didn't hesitate. The task grounded me. Slit the belly, gut the flesh, scrape the scales, salt it clean. Each step was simple, unlike the uncertain rhythm of my own body. I noticed the way the others worked in time with one another. It wasn't coordination, it was a kind of trust, like waves that learned to crash together across years of shared silence and labor. The room pulsed with quiet griefs and quiet hopes. I felt safer there than I had in weeks. The women talked as they worked, not to fill the silence, but because certain words needed to be spoken aloud, to be believed. I was in labor for 2 nights, someone muttered. My husband wept when he thought I wouldn't come back. It was the only time I saw him cry. I named my second boy after the river. He came fast, too fast, but he lived. My daughter never drew breath. Still, I named her. I whispered it into the fire, so she'd carry it to the other side. I kept slicing. Each word cut deeper than the knife. Stories wove themselves between the fish and flames. They weren't offered for comfort, but for honesty. And honesty was its own kind of sanctuary. Then someone, Ruth, I think, began talking about silver wire. They say if you tie it around your left toe during the waxing moon, the pain won't break you, she said, her voice barely above the hiss of steam. I paused, letting that image settle. A woman bent double with labor, a glint of metal on her toe, hoping it would save her. Did it work? I asked. Ruth smiled crookedly. I'm still here. I nodded, not at her story, but at her survival. That's what these gatherings were, about survival rituals. Not the kind spoken in sermons, but the kind women passed hand to hand like kitchen knives and birth towels. Between stories, I thought of Sister Agnes. Her pouch of herbs still hung by the hearth at home, releasing its scent whenever the fire flared. She had warned me not to put my faith in charms alone, but neither had she laughed at them. She knew what we all did. Sometimes a symbol was the only thing standing between you and the dark. Gilda turned to me quietly. You're thinking hard. I looked up, just listening. She offered a thin smile. Good, that's how you learn what to forget. I wanted to ask what she meant, but I didn't. Some wisdom you don't chase down, you wait for it to come back around. By midday, the work slowed. Some women drifted outside, stretching stiff backs. Others lingered, talking now in lower tones, the kind saved for confessions and secrets. I stayed. Something in me needed to stay. To absorb the way these women wrapped pain in story, to remind myself that I wasn't alone. Their lives were marked by the same aches, same fears, same stubborn pulses of hope. I wasn't carrying something special, I was joining a legacy older than the village itself. In the corner, two women argued softly over whether baptizing the unborn child in a dream could protect it. One swore she'd dreamed a priest with no face, pouring oil on her belly, and her child was born without cry, but with breath. Another said she'd dreamed the opposite, and it meant nothing. Dreams lie, she insisted. Better to trust boiled sage and the length of the moon's shadow on your window. I said nothing, but that night, I'd remember both stories, filing them beside the silver wire and the whispered names. As I gathered my things to leave, Gilda pressed something into my hand, a carving, rough, wooden, shaped like a crow. For the cradle, she said, to watch over him, or her, doesn't matter. I stared at the figure. Its wings were jagged, its beak open. It looked fierce and fragile all at once. Thank you, I whispered. She only nodded. Outside, the smoke clung to my skin like second breath. I walked home slow, the crow in one hand, the other resting on the curve of my belly. I didn't speak aloud, but the words formed anyway. You are not born yet, little one, but you are already part of something greater. That evening, as dusk swallowed the rooftops and chickens settled into their roosts, I sat by the hearth and turned the crow in my palm. I thought of the women and their stories, their births, their losses, their survival. I lit a single candle and placed the crow beside it. The flame danced, and for a moment, I believed the carved bird might take flight. I reached for my sewing kit, pulled out a scrap of cloth, and began to stitch again. Not words, not names, just shaped circles, spirals, waves, symbols of movement, endurance, returning. I wasn't sewing out of tradition, I was making memory. Each thread was a reminder. Pain could be carried, grief could be transformed, fear could be named and still not win. The fire crackled. Outside, a fog rolled in. I pulled my shawl closer, bent over my stitches, and breathed slow and deep. Tomorrow would bring more smoke, more salt, more stories. But tonight, I was full of them, and that was enough. The rain came without warning, soft at first, then relentless. It fell as though the sky had finally given up holding anything in. For 3 days, it washed over Mirefield in cold sheets, soaking the fields, bleeding into the seams of cottages, and collecting in silent pools along the footpaths. It filled the village like breath held too long, then released all at once. Inside our home, everything felt swollen and slow. The air hung damp and heavy, clinging to my skin, curling the edges of parchment, souring the scent of old firewood. The hearth crackled with defiance, but couldn't chase away the chill. My belly felt tighter now, the weight of the baby pulling at every part of me. Each movement came slower, each breath deeper. I found myself awake long into the night, sitting by the window, watching droplets race each other down warped glass. There's a loneliness that comes with the rain, something that seeps into your bones when the world refuses to dry. I began to talk to the child aloud, not for comfort, but to remind myself I was still someone. Still Elena, still more than just the womb people watched, like a prophecy. I think you'll like the sound of rain, I whispered one evening. Maybe you'll be born during a storm. Maybe you'll cry just once, and then listen. The baby didn't move, but something inside me softened. On the second day, a traveler arrived, in a brown cloak soaked to the knees, her pack slung over one shoulder, her boots caked in mud. I spotted her through the window, standing at the edge of the village, waiting to be noticed. Mirefield was wary of strangers, especially women alone, but we were also curious, and that curiosity opened doors faster than caution closed them. I was the first to meet her, not because I was brave, but because I was already outside, trying to empty a bucket of rain from the back steps. She spoke with a lilt I couldn't place, her voice warm but measured. "I trade in plants," she said, "roots, seeds, stories." She looked at my belly, then back at my face. "May I come in?" I hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the warmth returned slowly. She removed her soaked cloak and hung it near the fire. Her hair was streaked with gray and moss-colored ribbon. She moved like someone who knew she didn't need permission to belong. From her pack, she pulled bundles of dried herbs, tied with twine and scraps of paper. Some I recognized: lavender, sage, fennel, but others were strange, braided with things I didn't have names for. "You're close," she said, pointing toward my belly. "Not weeks away, but days. You'll feel it in your dreams first." I swallowed. "How do you know?" She shrugged, as if the question wasn't important. She offered me a vial, thick glass, sealed with wax. The liquid inside shimmered like old amber, oil of rosemary, blended with orange peel, a touch of clove. Rub it across your skin, lower belly, back, ankles, if they ache. It warms, softens, reminds your body not to forget how to open. Her words were strange, but not frightening. I handed her a loaf of barley bread in return. She accepted it like a fair trade. That night, after she left her boots squelching through the path toward the next house, I sat beside the fire, unwrapped the vial, and poured a few drops into my palm. The scent rose immediately, sharp, sweet, familiar, and foreign, all at once. I rubbed it gently into the skin, just below my ribs. Feeling warmth spread beneath my fingers like light beneath water. The baby turned slowly inside me. "You're listening," I said. "Aren't you?" Rain tapped against the window. The candlelight shimmered, and for the first time in days, my breath came without effort. I slept. I dreamt. In my dream, I stood in a field of rosemary, the stems high as my shoulders. The rain fell gently, soaking my clothes, but I wasn't cold. I walked slowly, pressing my palms against the leaves. Ahead of me was a small cradle carved of ash wood, floating gently in a stream. When I reached it, I saw the baby open, blinking slowly. They reached for me, not with desperation, but with recognition. When I woke, I cried, not from fear, but from relief. The next morning, I went outside barefoot. The rain had slowed to mist. The grass was thick with dew. I stood beneath the gray sky, arms crossed over my chest, letting the moisture settle on my skin. There was something ancient about it, like the world was being rinsed clean, making room for something new. Gilda found me that way. "Your toes will rot," she teased. "Then let them rot," I said, smiling. She joined me, barefoot too, and we stood like fools in the mist, laughing like children for a reason neither of us could name. Later, I returned to the herb bundle. I crushed a bit of rosemary into my tea. The bitterness startled me, but I drank it anyway. The village had grown, quieter during the rain. People moved slower. Conversations were softer. It was as if the world had agreed to hush, just long enough for the next part to begin. That afternoon, I sat by the window again, threading the charm I'd carved days earlier. The crow now had wings made of string and leaves. I tied a sprig of rosemary to its neck, for memory, for protection, for whatever it was the stranger had seen in me. I didn't know what to expect next, but for the first time, I didn't dread it. There's something sacred about rainwater. When it falls long enough, it doesn't just wet the earth, it reminds you that the earth is alive, that it changes, that it holds. I was changing, too, slowly, inevitably. The child inside me was no longer just a mystery. It was a conversation, a quiet one, unfolding in movement and stillness. That evening, Willem returned early. He smelled of wet wood and worn leather. He saw the bundle of herbs on the table, the oil vial beside it. "What's that?" he asked. "Help," I said simply. He nodded, sat beside me, said nothing more. We sat in silence, the fire between us. Outside, the last of the rain fell in silver threads, barely touching the roof before disappearing. The storm hadn't ended. It had only shifted, changed direction, changed name, and I, at the center of it, finally felt still. There are days that unfold like threads in a tapestry, quiet, steady, invisible, until much later. And then there are days that split the world in two. The day it happened, the day everything changed, began like any other. With ash on my fingers and hunger in my bones. The storm had passed. The skies were pale again, streaked with blue and pink like bruises beginning to heal. The air outside smelled of thawing earth and washed stone. Mirefield moved slowly that morning, cautious after the rain, as if we were all waiting for the village to remember how to breathe. I was alone. Willem had gone out early, leaving a hat and 2 boiled eggs on the table. I sat and ate in silence. My feet were swollen. My back wouldn't bend without aching, but I still had tasks. I still had to keep moving. There was wood to gather, wet branches from the shed that needed splitting and drying before the cold night returned. I pulled on my cloak and stepped outside. Everything was slick with mud. My boots sank deep with every step toward the woodpile behind the house. I cursed softly under my breath, pressing my hand to my lower back as I bent to pick up a bundle of kindling. That's when it happened. My foot slid on the moss-slick stone. Not far, just enough. I didn't fall hard, but it was sudden, jarring. My hands hit the ground, the sharp sting of gravel tearing through skin. My knees buckled. I felt the twist in my ankle, a flash of heat, and then pressure low in my belly, deep and insistent. Not pain, not at first, just change. I stayed on the ground, breath shallow, the world muffled as if covered in cloth. For a moment, I couldn't move. I wasn't scared yet. I was listening, not to the birds or the wind, but to something inside. A silence. Then, a slow, tight pulse. I crawled inside, dragging the wood behind me out of habit, more than need. I dropped it by the hearth and sank to the floor. The baby didn't move, or maybe I didn't know if it had. My hands trembled as I reached for a cloth to wipe the blood from my palms. I told myself I was fine, that I'd slipped, that this was nothing, but something had shifted. I could feel it. I waited. An hour, then another. I drank water, ate a slice of bread, sat still, legs crossed, breathing slow, listening. Finally, I felt it again, a tightening, deep, longer than before. I pressed both hands to my belly. "Not yet," I whispered. "Please, not yet, not yet." I sent Rosa, the baker's daughter, to find Sister Agnes. By the time she arrived, dusk had already stained the windows gray. She entered briskly, removed her shawl, and knelt beside me without asking a single question. Her hands were cool and firm. She felt my belly, listened, waited, then met my eyes. "It's begun," she said softly, but slowly. "You're not in labor yet, but the body's preparing." I wanted to cry, not from fear, from the weight of knowing I couldn't stop what had started. Agnes stood, surveyed the room, then turned to me again. "From now on, no lifting, no fetching, no carrying anything but breath." I nodded. She added, "And keep the fire going. Warmth will help. The cold invites trouble." She left behind another pouch, this one thicker, heavier, and said to steep it overnight. I did what she said, but sleep would not come. That night, I sat at the table in the candlelight and wrote a letter to the baby. It was nothing more than ink and hope. "To Ash," I began, "I haven't seen your face. I don't know you'll cry. but I know your rhythm, your kicks, your stillness after I hum. I know how you turn when I press my hand here, how you stretch when I whisper your name. The ink smeared halfway through. I wiped it with my sleeve and kept writing. If you come soon, I will be ready. If you stay longer, I'll wait. Just know, I already love you, and I am already yours. I folded the letter and placed it in the cradle Willem had built, rough and imperfect, but ours. The next day, the village changed. It wasn't loud, it was subtle and undercurrent. Eyes followed me more closely. Gilda brought extra broth. Rosa returned with a warm cloth and wouldn't say who sent it. Even Willem came home earlier than usual, hands full of firewood already split. He didn't speak much, but he sat closer, watched the fire longer, and when I fell asleep sitting up, he covered my shoulders with his own cloak. They knew. Everyone knew. The moment before something breaks is quieter than you expect. It isn't chaos, it's anticipation. A breath held for too long. The pressure returned that night, stronger, steadier. Still not pain, but enough to make me rise from bed and pace the floor, hand pressed low on my abdomen. The candle flickered on the table. Outside, an owl called from the trees. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I spoke aloud. You're coming, aren't you? I don't know if the baby answered, but I knew the truth. Nothing would be the same after this, and I was ready. Time didn't stop, but it softened. The days didn't race, they unfolded, like the slow turning of a page you aren't quite ready to read. After the first stirrings that signaled everything was changing, something inside me calmed. Not because I was less afraid, but because I began to understand what might hold me together in the middle of everything coming undone. There's a rhythm to waiting. I found it in the smallest things, pressing dried lavender into pouches, stirring lentils with rosemary stems, whispering to the fire before dawn. These weren't rituals born from belief. They were the pieces I could still control. When the world shifted too fast, I returned to the tangible. The warmth of water poured over my swollen feet, the hum of a lullaby I barely remembered from my mother's mouth, the feel of wood shavings as I carved tiny animals from leftover scraps. I wasn't good at carving. My fox looked like a dog with a broken nose. The sheep resembled a lopsided cloud. Still, I lined them beside the cradle. They were mine, and in some way, they were his or hers. Ashes. The name lived inside me now. I hadn't spoken it aloud, again, but every time I placed a new charm by the cradle, I said it silently, a whisper of hope, not promise. I couldn't promise anything. Not here, not in Mirefield. Outside, life moved on. The village grew quieter as the leaves began to crisp and fall. The rain had left behind a deep scent of earth and fire. Women began storing jars of preserved fruit. Men mended fences. Children threw stones at the river and dared each other to shout into the woods. The season was shifting, and so was I. Each morning I rose slower. My hips burned. My fingers were numb by sunrise. Some days I could barely tie my boots without stopping to breathe, but I didn't ask for help. That wasn't pride. It was a form of endurance, proving to myself that I was still present, still functioning, still whole in some fractured way. On one of those mornings, Gilda came by with a bundle of dried mint and a folded piece of cloth. She didn't say much, just placed it in my hands and nodded toward the cradle. We're weaving charms, she said, for the new one. Later that afternoon, women from the village began arriving. Some came with scraps of yarn, others with ribbon, buttons, shells. They gathered in my home without ceremony, their voices soft, their laughter restrained, but real. We sat in a circle, by the hearth. Each woman braided her charm and tied it off with a story. Not an explanation, just a memory. My son never liked sleep, said one. I tied red thread on his pillow every night. My daughter sang before she spoke. Loud. 2. Never stopped. My third was born with his eyes open. Scared the life out of me, but I knew then he was older than me somehow. The room filled with quiet grief, quiet joy. We weren't trading facts. We were weaving legacy. Even the silences said something. I braided my ribbon with rosemary and added a single hawthorn, thorn sharp and fragrant, a reminder that strength and beauty grow side by side, and neither is enough without the other. For protection, I murmured. When they left, the cradle looked different. Not fuller, not fancier, but braver. As if the stories hung from its rails could hold it steady through the storm to come. That night, I watched the shadows from the fire dance across the ceiling. Willem had fallen asleep in the chair, one hand draped across his chest, his mouth parted in dreamless rest. I didn't wake him. I couldn't speak the things I was thinking, not yet. Instead, I lay back and placed both hands on my belly. I felt the slow, heavy shift of the baby inside. Not a kick, not a flutter, a turning, a reminder. I began to hum again, the same tune my mother used to hum while steeping tea. The notes came broken, uncertain, but as they stretched, I remembered the shape of them. I remembered the safety of being held in that sound, so I sang to Ash. I sang through the tremble in my throat, through the dryness in my eyes. I sang because I didn't know what else to do. Because when your body becomes the place where two hearts beat, you begin to understand that wholeness isn't a perfect circle. It's the stitching between every tear you've learned to hold. When the candle finally burned low and the last echo of my voice faded, I whispered to the dark, "I'm ready to meet you," and I meant it. But I also meant this: if you need more time, I'll wait. Because real love is not in the moment you hold something perfect. It's in the days you hold on while it's still forming, trembling, unsure. It's what keeps you whole. The air that night held a different weight. It wasn't colder, not really, but it pressed against the windows and walls like something alive, something waiting. I felt it before I saw it, before anything shifted or stirred an invisible thread, tightening, calling everything in me to attention. The wind outside had gone still, but inside my chest, a storm was building. I moved slower than usual, every step marked by awareness. Willem had stayed close all day, chopping wood with a kind of reverence, his movements quieter, measured. We hadn't spoken much, there wasn't anything left to say that words could carry. He simply watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, as if memorizing the way I moved, the curve of my back, the angle of my hand when I stirred the stew. Dinner had been quiet. My appetite had already begun to disappear, replaced by a restlessness I couldn't name. I pushed food around my plate while Willem sat beside me, chewing slowly, eyes flicking to my face every few minutes. When I finally looked up, he reached across the table and rested his hand on mine. It was warm, calloused, familiar. I held it longer than I needed to. When the dishes were washed and the fire stoked, I sat by the cradle we had set near the hearth. The carvings along its edge were rough, but careful, each line etched with hope and uncertainty. I ran my fingers along the top rail and thought of all the nights I had sat here dreaming of the weight that would soon fill this space. Ash moved low inside me slowly now, deliberately. It was no longer the frantic flutter of early life, but something deeper, heavier, as if he, too, was waiting. I lit a single candle, letting the flame flicker and stretch, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The room felt smaller, tonight, more sacred. I sat back and pulled the shawl around my shoulders. The ache in my back had grown into a dull throb. It wasn't unbearable, not yet, but it hummed through me like a low chant, steady and rhythmic. I pressed both hands to my belly and breathed, not the shallow breaths I'd grown used to, but full ones, deep and slow. With each exhale, I tried to release the fear. Not all of it would go. Some was stitched into me now, but I let the edges fray. The herbs Agnes had left filled the room, with scent lavender and thyme, and something darker beneath it I couldn't quite name. I closed my eyes and let the smell wash over me. I imagined it curling into the spaces between my ribs, softening the places that had grown rigid with anticipation. Outside, the sky deepened into ink. One by one, candles in neighboring homes were snuffed out, the village settling into the kind of sleep only winter can bring. But I stayed awake, watching the embers shift and break apart in the hearth. Willem came to stand beside me. He didn't speak, just knelt and rested his head gently against my knee. I threaded my fingers through his hair. His breath was warm against the wool of my dress, and we stayed like that until the candle burned halfway down and the shadows grew. Still, when he finally climbed into bed, I remained where I was, unwilling to leave the small comfort of firelight. The cradle beside me felt like a promise, a beginning. I wanted to remember it like this, quiet, untouched, waiting. Eventually, I joined him beneath the covers. His body was warm, solid, steady. I curled beside him, my back pressed to his chest, and he wrapped an arm around me without a word. I listened to his breathing, let it guide mine. For a while, I drifted, but just before sleep could claim me, a sharp pulling sensation deep inside brought me fully awake. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even pain. It was truth, clean and unrelenting. This was it. The night before was no longer. Before it had already begun. I didn't wake him. Not yet. I turned to face the ceiling, one hand cradling the weight of my belly, and whispered into the dark, "I'm ready," even if I wasn't. Especially because I wasn't. Because readiness isn't about being fearless. It's about staying, breathing, holding, even as the world begins to tilt. And in that moment, as the night curled tighter around the walls of our home, I understood something I hadn't before. This night, the last one before I became someone entirely new, was its own kind of birth, a quiet unraveling, a surrender, a promise kept only by living through it. Ash stirred again. I breathed and waited. The first contraction broke the night silence like a low drum, distant yet undeniable. I lay in the dim glow of the candle, time stretching thin between every throb, each wave of pressure deeper than the last. Willem stirred beside me, his hand reaching instinctively for mine, even before I opened my eyes. We didn't speak, there were no words for the moment, but in his touch I heard the echo of all we had waited for. I rose slowly, knees trembling, and moved toward the cradle. My breath came in slow gasps, breath in, breath out, counting through the ache. The room felt tight, smaller by the second, each shadow pressed close. I gazed at the wooden carvings, crooked lines, and in perfect shape. Sand remembered how we had made them together, hopes etched into wood, small prayers saved from the elements. Ash shifted beneath my hand, a subtle movement that steadied me. It was the reminder I needed. I wasn't alone in this. My body was changing, yes, but so was he. And just like that, I felt the shift from anticipation to purpose, from waiting to doing. My voice came out a whisper, low and firm. "We're ready." Willem guided me gently toward the hearth, where Sister Agnes had laid a basin of warm water. She emerged from the shadows to meet me, candlelight dancing across her lined face, strong and as steady as the seasons. With no ceremony, not now, she knelt in front of me and dipped her hands into the water. She brought them to my feet first, then slowly upward, washing each part of me with clear, warm intention. Each touch unfurled a layer of fear. I knelt as she drew clean cloths from a basket, the oil she'd brought earlier herbed with lavender, rosemary, and a dark thorn wordless prayer was warm on my skin when she rubbed it into my back and thighs. It burned in all the right places, focusing my breath. The cradle beside us creaked in the hush, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. Labor came in waves, surging, pausing, breathing. Sister Agnes guided me through each one, when to lean forward, when to grip the edge of the table, when to push. It was not graceful. It was gritty and wild and utterly real. Willem stayed at my side, cloth damp, offering sips of warm broth and whispers of "You're strong." But strength and birth are different things. One dose of courage isn't enough. You keep taking them. At one point, I choked on a scream metal incombustible. The pain was no longer distant. It was a storm inside me. My hands dug into the carved rail of that small cradle, my knuckles white as bone. I gritted teeth I didn't know I had. Agnes brushed my hair from my face and murmured, "Ash is coming, Elena." Icy head. Just one more breath. I pressed my palms to my belly and whimpered, something like a prayer and a plea. "Come, please, come." And he did. The birth was a rush of heat and sound, a shift, a gasp, a cry. I caught him before he even finished the world, a small being, slick and urgent, breath first. The air stung my nostrils, rich with blood and new life. Agnes laid him on my chest, and Willem crouched beside us, tears wet on his beard. Ash was perfect, though I only found out later that he had a cry deeper than I could have imagined. Wide eyes that searched for mine first, then tracked the candlelight, then closed in time to sleep. He stayed on my chest, curling against me, tiny cot made of ribs and rolling tides. The cradle, with its handmade carvings and charms, waited unused, already obsolete. What comfort it offered was here, in my arms. The world outside shifted as though to accommodate us. I felt it in the way the fire popped once, then steadied. In the way Ash's tiny hand clutched my finger, and I clutched back. In the way I understood something fundamental. This pain, this night, had changed me. I had gone through a storm and emerged holding everything precious. Sister. Agnes cleaned what needed cleaning without asking my consent. Willem warmed fresh cloths and boiled water for broth. Outside, the village woke slowly, an owl's wing beat, the distant call of a rooster, the soft hush of wind across mossy rooftops. Ash squeaked softly, a promise of tomorrow. I kissed the top of his head. He smelled of salt and new beginnings. In that small candlelit room, Ash became ours. Tomorrow, we would meet the village again. Tomorrow, others would say their piece. But tonight, in the hush of leftover pain and overwhelming love, we were complete. Because Ash was here, and we were home. Morning broke gently over Mirefield, not with fanfare or flooding sunlight, but with the hush of a world that had just exhaled after a long, purposeful breath. Through the narrow window pane, pale gold light spilled quietly into the cottage, illuminating, drifting dust motes as if they were suspended wishes. The cradle remained by the hearth, empty for the first time in days. The bundles of lavender and rosemary still hung from the beams above, and the scent of smoke and herbs lingered like a prayer. But one thing was infinitely different. Ash was. Here, I lay in the quiet warmth of the bed, Ash nestled against my chest. Every rise and fall of his tiny body anchoring me to the now. His breath was irregular, but strong, a soft reminder of the work we'd just accomplished. With every exhale, I felt my own body ease, settling into this new shape. Mother, the weight of him not heavy, but real, rested perfectly against me, as though he had always belonged. Willem sat at the foot of the bed, knees drawn close, eyes soft and reflective. There was no need for him to smile. His presence held more than 1,000 words. I watched him take in each minute, motion my hand, brushing Ash's slick, warm skin, the child's chest rising with soft determination. In that moment, we weren't two half-bare hearts facing a harsh world. We were three, bound by love forged in pain and carried forward in hope. When Sister Agnes slipped in before Dono knocking, just a faint breath behind the door, she brought with her a basket of clean linen, the basin already emptied. She didn't speak. Instead, she placed her hands on my shoulder, steady, sure. Her eyes said everything I needed to hear. Well done. She had seen this moment too many times, and yet each one held its own daylight. Gently, she smoothed the blankets and withdrew, leaving us in a hush that hummed louder than any cry. Outside, the village began to stir. I heard the faint clatter of early risers harnessing buckets, the soft crack of gates, the distant clamor of animal pens awakening to early chores. The world, unchanged, and yet entirely different. Through the window, I caught sight of barefoot children skipping across slick stones, their laughter as innocent as a morning breeze. For them, life marched on. For me, it had pivoted. Ash stirred, a sleepy flutter of limbs that brought me from my reverie. I shifted to cradle him fully in my arms, and whispered softly, "You're here." My voice raw from labor, steady with all felt foreign at first, but it slipped between us, into a kind of truth I'd never known before. First bath. Willem rose quietly, and handed me the basin of warm water Agnes had left. He sat beside the cradle, between us, and watched as I gently lifted Ash into the water. I supported his neck with tenderness, his wet skin wrinkled and soft, his eyes closing against the warmth. For a moment, I saw the reflection of what we'd all gone through my swollen hands. Willem's weary stance, the cradle's carvings etched with hope and love. Then I met his little face again, and the world made sense. He responded to the water, a small sigh escaping him, his toes curling as if discovering each sensation anew. I hummed quietly, remembering the lullaby Agnes had murmured during labor. Willem's hand settled on my shoulder, grounding me, sharing the weight that no longer felt too heavy to bear. By midday, Gilda had come, as she always does after a birth. She didn't knock, she just stepped in. Arms full of broth and linen, and a tiny blue clay bird she pressed into my palm before filling Ash's cradle with soft cloth. She settled by the fire and watched us, knitting in silence, as though every stitch held meaning beyond her fingers weaving. "He's perfect," she said softly after a time, her fingertips brushing Ash's blanket, as if to affirm the reality. I managed a tired smile. "He has your chin," I told her. She laughed gently, the sound bright in the dim cottage, and said quietly, in the eyes of someone who's been here before. Rosa, later that evening, brought a woven cap and salted fish, placing both by the hearth with maternal care. She traced a line of spit-dampened hair from the cradle with her eyes and nodded once. Tomlin's wife arrived soon after, with honey, bread, and a quiet blessing. An old woman I barely knew came last, placing a smooth stone beside Ash's head and pressing my hand with a knowing nod. "For peaceful dreams," she whispered. None spoke too much. In Mirefield, ceremony was gentle respect, born of shared memories, not spectacle. For them, life's greatest tenderness was found in simple acts: a spoon of broth, a warm cloth, a carved bird placed just so. Their quiet reverence held more comfort than grand celebration. Sunset approached slowly, painting the walls with drifting warmth. I stepped to the doorway, holding Ash close, and inhaled the cool evening air. He lay perfectly still in my arms, bright eyes tracking everything's shadows. Wood grain, flicker of firelight, the rhythmic sway of my body. I whispered to him the old stories, of birds that find their way home, of rivers that flow through storms, of mothers who carry worlds within them. Willem joined me, standing shoulder to shoulder. He didn't speak, there were no words until he finally murmured, "It's good." That single word was everything. We returned inside and laid Ash in his cradle for the first time, near the hearth's last embers. His arms stirred briefly, searching. I placed the tiny crow charm we'd made above his head. I braided strands of my own hair loosely around it, adding the weight of our hopes. Then I began to hum, softly enough that it sounded like reassurance rather than song. Something older than melody, something elemental. He stilled. The cottage exhaled. The world outside paused for a heartbeat, acknowledging the fragility and power of what we had wrought. The fire glowed low, the smoke curled upward in slow spirals, and Ash slept. Willem and I watched, our reflections in his dark eyes. I touched his cheek and whispered, "Stay." And he did. We made one small circle around the cradle, both of us, hearts tethered, teeth sore from pain and cheeks stung with tears we'd refused earlier. We rocked our hands lightly against its frame, counting out breaths and promises. He would be loved. He would be safe. He would always have a place in a world that sometimes forgot it, but not here, not with us. Night deepened. Animals settled. The sharp breath of wind at the window softened into lullaby. We sat wrapped in each other's presence, watching Ash glow, watching Ash breathe. "Do you think we'll sleep soon?" Willem asked. I managed a small, honest laugh. Maybe. We both knew sleep would come fragmented that first night, weighed by new life and its needs, but it would come, and so would tomorrow. My body still ached, echoing the night before, but we'd passed through the storm and arrived indeed. We had. Before us lay a world reorient, shaped around this tiny being who carried dreams in his small chest. And though nothing could ever return to how it was, everything we would become began in that sacred moment. I held Ash loosely, not wanting to disturb his breath. I let myself breathe with him, thinking of those who stood beside me 3 nights wait, bound in love, ribbons, chants, tears, and timber. Of those who had held me, whose stories lay in the grain of the cradle, in the scent of herbs, in the hush of the hearth. I thought of storms weathered and the fragile dawn that followed. "In you," I whispered, "I see all of us." He moved, a stretch of arms, a soft sigh. Willem reached out, brushing my hair behind my ear, and pressed a soft kiss to my temple. We stayed there, one family in a room guided by candlelight, feeling the world settle around us like a blanket. Pain had passed through me, as mountains let down their armor after a long siege. But beyond it lay something deeper: warmth, purpose, possibility. Ash rose and fell on fragile waves of breath. The cottage pulsed with renewed life. I realized this was not just a new chapter, it was a new world. And though I didn't know what storms might come again, I knew who we were. I knew I was stronger than I'd ever believed. Because I had borne life, I had held it. I had found the sun after the storm died, and here, in the hush of aftermath, I finished the lullaby with a smile. The world listened on, so did Ash. When we stepped back and breathed through the story of Elena, of Willem, and of the child they named Ash, we don't just see the echoes of a medieval village or the weight of pregnancy under candlelit rafters. We witness something far more human, timeless. Even, we see endurance, we see transformation, and we see the quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself to be profoundly real. Elena began her journey not as a heroine, not as a warrior or sage, but as a woman surviving a world that offered her little comfort and even less choice. Mirefield was not a land of magic, it was one of mud, of judgmental whispers, of aching backs and endless toil. And yet within that simplicity lived something luminous. She carried life within her while being told how fragile she was. She bore the weight of generations while being denied a voice in her own story. What makes Elena unforgettable is not what happened to her, but how she responded. When the stares from the villagers pierced, she stayed kind. When the aches grew unbearable, she pressed onward. When fear of childbirth lingered like a shadow in her own home, she didn't run from it. She carved a charm, stirred a potion, whispered a lullaby. She dared to believe in her own strength, even when the world didn't hand it to her. And Willem, quiet and present, is the reminder that strength often shows up in silence. He was never the center of the story, but he stood at its edges, holding it together, carving wood, fetching herbs, watching the rise and fall of breath beside the cradle. He wasn't the storm, but the roof that held. Together, they brought Ash into a world that doesn't slow down for new life. And in that moment, the world didn't need to, because something eternal had already shifted inside their home. Elena didn't just birth a child, she birthed a new version of herself. One with cracked hands, yes, and tired eyes, but with a power forged in quiet courage, in letting go, in becoming dot. So what do we take from all of this? We take the truth that life's most powerful moments are not loud. They don't always come with parades or applause. Sometimes they come in the form of a baby's breath, a fire's flicker, a woman whispering, "I'm ready," to a night that doesn't answer back. The story of Elena teaches us that strength isn't found in defying pain. It's found in walking through it with open arms. And in our modern world so full of noise, pressure, comparison, Elena's story reminds us to return to something ancient, presence. It reminds us to listen, to breathe, to touch life gently, even when it feels too heavy. That sometimes surviving is sacred, that creating space for new life, for change, for self-growth, is its own kind of revolution. Whether you're a mother or not, whether you've lived through storms or are still bracing against them, story is for you. It's about finding strength in unexpected places. It's about honoring your journey even when no one else sees it. And it's about remembering that the smallest voices, those of newborns, of women in quiet villages, of your own buried hopes, often carry the loudest truths. Now we want to hear from you. What part of Elena's journey spoke to you the most? Was it her resilience, her quiet bravery, or the unspoken support of those around her? If you could carry one lesson from this story into your own life, what would it be? Comment below with your thoughts. Share your reflections. Let's build a space where your voice joins the circle, where your perspective becomes part of the story. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or simply helped you rest a little easier tonight, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps this channel grow and gives us the motivation to bring you even more heartfelt, meaningful stories like this one. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And wherever you are, remember, your story matters too.